TMR team, and thank you to Maurizio, Pankaj, and their colleagues at the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for making this happen. I'm very fortunate to be moderating a discussion with four excellent speakers, all of whom I know very well, although we are all now in different time zones, from Washington to London to Tokyo to Brussels. Hopefully we over the next half an hour or so, we'll have a very good conversation with them. I'm going to start off by just asking each of the panelists sort of a question, hopefully to sort of set the stage and build upon a discussion, and then we can have follow-ups after that and questions from the audience. So to start off, I'll turn to Jeff. Jeff, if you could help a little bit with setting the stage. We've seen over the last few months, weeks, months, years, greater friction, of course, between China on the one hand, and many countries around its periphery, not least India, where there's a continuing standoff on the border between India and China. Also with the United States, and this year has seen unprecedented sparring between China and the US. So in some ways, walk us through what we have seen and how the regional order has been influenced and shaped. What are the drivers and what are the points of contention currently? Over to you.
Great. Yeah, great question. Thank you, Dhruva. And thanks to everyone else joining us today in the audience, and also my co-panelists. It's good to see you all again, be here to talk about an important topic. I would argue that what we've seen over the past year, and really I do think it's been a rather dramatic transformation, not only of India's relationship with China, but America's relationship with China. I think there has been a fundamental reshaping of this triangle, frankly. And that's not the only thing that's changed. I think there have been changes underway in Australia and Europe in how they see China and Chinese behavior. But I think the changes have been most profound with India and the United States. And I think in part what they've done is help bring the two countries closer together, but they've also underscored the need and the meaning behind the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. I think this has been a product of crystallizing concerns about China for many years now that has prompted us to see the value in promoting a operating code for the region, for a rules-based order, for the democracies of the Indo-Pacific, the need for them to get on the same page in promoting a positive vision for the region, but also drawing red lines at what they see as unacceptable offenses to their national interests, but also the global order and the global commons. And it's been trending in this direction for many, many years. Frankly, not even the rise of President Xi Jinping in 2013. I think you can go back to 2008 and the global financial crisis, the Beijing Olympics, and the collapse of the first iteration of the Quad that year. And frankly, it goes back even further than that. And when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, we talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific, these were ideas that were really promoted by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe back in 2006. He saw, 15 years ahead of some of the rest of us, I think, some of the troubles that were coming, and he saw the need for the democracies of the region and Europe to get on the same page and promote this normative vision for the Indo-Pacific that would help, I think, restrain countries like China from crossing our red lines, infringing on our interests and the rules-based order. And so these trends have been in play now for many years, but what's happened over the past year is certainly in the US, I feel like there has been pressure building. And in 2020, the pipes burst. The pressure finally reached a critical mass. And you've seen the Trump administration, as you alluded to, unveil a wave of measures designed to, frankly, put the US-China relationship on more equitable ground. There's a lot of people here in the US that think that the Chinese have frankly been taking advantage of the US and playing by a different set of rules for many years. And this notion and hope that perhaps they could be persuaded to become more liberal, to play by the rules, to trade more fairly, that argument was persuasive for many years, and it no longer has takers in Washington. And so there's a general consensus, I think, bipartisan general consensus, that we need to do more to push back, and we need to make this a more equitable relationship. And I think those same kind of, that same reckoning is happening in capitals across the Indo-Pacific and in Europe to different degrees. I think the crisis with India at the border has really galvanized the debate there. And so we see an acceleration of trends that were already underway for many years, but have been elevated, frankly, due to China's behavior since the outbreak of the pandemic, where they have only grown more aggressive and more repressive. And so I think I'll leave it at that for now, but I look forward to follow-up. Thank you, Dhruva.
Thanks, Jeff. That sort of sets the stage for, we're seeing this sort of growing intensification of competition amongst the sort of major powers. Darshana, I want to bring you in on this. You're somebody who's been tracking particularly the relationships between what some describe as the middle powers, that is not the US and China, but India, Japan, Australia, France, Indonesia. Tell us a little bit about how some of these countries are responding to what is basically a more competitive, adversarial international environment, driven in some ways by a growing, increasingly assertive China and a US that is now in some ways pushing back.
Sure. Thank you, Dhruva, and thank you, TMR, for bringing us all together. I wish this was happening in person, but really good to see a lot of familiar faces and friends. I agree with what Jeff really said, that the kind of this relationship, the US-China, the relationship that's been unfolding, it's been seen across capitals, and how what you said, a middle power is most of these countries, whether it was India, Australia, Indonesia, there was this question until about a year ago where these countries stand, even Europe, right? Like, are you going to take a stand for China? Are you going to take a stand against China? At times, those stands or the kind of the approach towards China was considered vague. India has at times questioned Australia's intent, keeping in mind that it's the largest trading partner. Similar questions about India, but in the last year or so, and more importantly, I think in the last 6 months or so, the relationship between each of these countries and China has drastically changed. It has changed drastically in terms of, with regards to Japan, China, for the first time, has maintained their ships around disputed waters consistently for over 100 days. So that was the first time that they crossed over kind of a threshold. The conflict that's going on with India, the diplomatic standoff with Australia, to the point that they do not even have any journalists, any correspondents in Australia, whether it is from a surveillance point of view, cyber, it is spanned across different domains. Indonesia has had kind of called on their ambassadors because there's been Chinese ships in their waters, in their exclusive economic zones. So you can see this kind of, hostile activities, hostile engagement between each of these countries in China, which has definitely changed their bilateral relationship with China, but also how these countries interact with each other. It has shaped how India, Australia are discussing things. It has shaped how India, EU is discussing policies, what they're talking about. I think there is a lot more common ground now. If there was some sort of a dilemma, if there was some sort of kind of a hesitation to take on a more stronger stance, we can see that there are now a more acceptance towards the problem, at least defining what the problem is or defining what the challenge is. We've seen that with Germany's new kind of strategy. Garima will definitely, I'm sure we'll talk more about that. There's definitely been shifts in that, and Japan for a very long time has been trying to bring Europe into the Indo-Pacific, both at the bilateral level and also as a region, whether it's UK or France, more from a military point of view, more in terms of sending ships into the East China Sea, or with the European Union or Europe as a whole in terms of the rules-based international order, that Europe has been really a key agency in Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific, in kind of upholding the rules-based order, international norms. Europe has really been important in that. Even for India, I mean, I think it was Shiv who said, can we get past the trade and, some of the difficulties? And I think India has had this kind of difficulties with each of these countries. But even with Europe, you can see there is more of an effort to find common ground. And I think that common ground somewhere has materialized in the Indian Ocean region as a starting point. What really can be done, India and Europe. You also have the maritime security dialogue, where they discuss essentially what needs to be done. And the difference that I see in terms of the middle powers, in terms of whether it's India, Australia, India, Japan, or Europe as a whole, is the difference in terms of non-traditional security issues and traditional security issues. If with Australia, Japan, we are looking more at, say, both non-traditional and traditional security issues, which includes exercises, which includes signing off LIMOA. India and Japan just signed the AXA, which allows kind of use which completes India's logistic facilities agreement with all the Quad countries now. With Europe, it's more about blue economy, it's more about illegal fishing, it's more about sustainable development, climate change, solar alliance, and these are all issues that are of interest to really the littorals and the Indian Ocean region countries and the islands. And one of the way I think where India looks at Europe is also in a way to offer alternatives to Chinese-led initiatives. Because I think there is a recognition that we have challenges in terms of the capital and also expertise, which Europe has plenty in terms, and Europe has a direct engagement, whether it's with Indian Ocean Council or even IORA. So that expertise is something I think India is looking to leverage. But I think even in that, even through the US-China kind of competition, the middle powers is somewhere coming together to see how this competition can be managed. So I think the question is, the concern is that it does not go into an hostile environment, although that window might be closing in faster for everyone. But the question is how to manage this relationship and how to balance their bilateral relationship with China.
Thanks, Darshana. We can, since the session is really about sort of Europe's role. I mean, the next two speakers I think can address that in much more detail. And so, turning to Theresa, sort of a consistent theme you hear from, perhaps waning, but still a consistent theme you hear from many in Europe and also in Southeast Asia and frankly in some of the other countries as well, is this idea that the US and China should not force us to take sides. And some might criticize that as sort of a way of not making decisions as basically either lazy or so avoiding the problem, not really trying to address some of the very real challenges that we face. So could you talk a little bit about how sort of the views in Europe are changing? Is that still consistent, or is there, as we see in the context of Wang Yi's recent visit to Europe, is there now a shift underway?
Well, thank you very much to the organizers. I'm really honored to be with this group and amazed by the colleagues' contributions. It's a very hot topic these days, especially recently with the German enunciation of the Indo-Pacific strategy, which I know Garima is going to speak about. But this idea, as you mentioned very politely, like some people call it fence-sitting, and the Europeans would. So I think of it as three approaches. And with 27 EU member states, we really haven't seen any clarity yet. We've had the June 22nd EU-China summit, which ended with no deliverables. And we just had the recent leaders meeting on Monday, again, with just a GI agreement that was negotiated over a year ago, signed to show that they had some sort of a deliverable. But we've seen a huge change in sentiment. It was already beginning before the pandemic. The more Europe was exposed to China, actually, the less they liked it, according to Pew polling. So there was already a downward trajectory with European views of China, which were only accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So this idea that Europe is in a sex sandwich, stuck between China and the US, and they have no power and they're just stuck in there. I was at a conference in Berlin about a year ago, and there was a massive wall, and on the screen, they had, it was like a vice. And on the left side was Uncle Sam, and on the right side was a Chinese dragon. And in the middle was Europe holding all of their like planes and trains and automobiles, and they're just like trying not to be squeezed. So I think this is a comfortable narrative for them. But if you look at that picture, it's the same type of picture you would have seen during the Cold War. So I had just gone to the European Museum, and you literally see the same metaphor, the same kind of symbolism. And I would say that, Europe wants to have it all ways. So there's a big discussion about strategic autonomy. Well, I would say that many times they don't go along with what the US has asked. And under the Trump administration, we have seen probably the first time in my life, a US administration that was not very pro-EU. Donald Trump has described Europe as a foe. And so he was kind of disengaged from Europe. So it's difficult to say that you're pressuring us when you're actually ignoring them. And for the Chinese, it's part of their longer term strategy to try to to erode the transatlantic alliance, to kind of pull Europe into its orbit, and especially with the Belt and Road Initiative. So this overland part, having this entire continental economy, plus you have the maritime leg of it. So China has seen themselves as being extremely successful in this. Like many countries, Russia, sometimes the US, China has chosen a position of divide and conquer. And if you look at the trade figures, Germany clearly is head and shoulders over all the other EU member states. 40% of their exports go to China. So it's a taboo thing. You really can't say it in Brussels, but Germany has a big impact on China policy and the formulation of it, but you're not supposed to say that. So it's, of course, the German Franco group plus all the other member states, and we know all it takes when you have 27 EU member states is to have one country to say no. And China has been very effective in stalling any sort of policy measures that they don't like, or at least watering them down if they can't stop them completely. So this kind of change in view between Europe and China, we've seen, especially as you mentioned from your comment with Wang Yi's visit, and some have described it as damage control. Others have described it as putting out fires, whereas some French officials have described it as a charm offensive. And on Wednesday at a recent conference held in Germany that I saw online, it was described as a charm offensive. So there's no real consensus, and everyone sees things differently depending on where they sit. So I think that we're really coming to a crunch time, and we've seen that it's very difficult for the EU to speak with one voice on these issues. I was very delighted to see that Germany came up with the Indo-Pacific strategy, and I'm going to stay in my lane, but this is such a monumental change, because in Brussels, you couldn't even say the term Indo-Pacific because it was perceived as carrying baggage, American views. So the fact that Germany could articulate that is a watershed moment. And I learned this the hard way. 2 years ago, I organized a conference here in Brussels on the Indo-Pacific, and people canceled at the last minute because they were told by their bosses, you can't participate. That term is not allowed in Brussels. So we've seen a slow evolution, but a welcome evolution. And I think that the sentiment is changing. We've seen German business interests are also concerned about what's happening. It's really difficult to say, we have a car factory right next to a re-education camp in Xinjiang. So we're even seeing Joe Kaiser, who is with Siemens, make statements which was unheard of just a few weeks ago. So he has come out with a statement very hard on China. So I think people are sensing the public sentiment, especially I think Hong Kong was a wake-up moment for many Europeans, more so than even Xinjiang. So there's this growing concern about China, their increased assertiveness all over the world, South China Sea, East China Sea, India, border area, Taiwan, that I've never seen in my almost 20 years working on this, Europe so exercised about what China is doing. So let's see where this is going to go. And let me make sure I hit all my notes here. Okay, transatlantic drift has been a big problem under the Trump administration. But I would also add that late in the day, but very promising, we've seen Secretary of State Pompeo try to cultivate better relations with Europe. And we've also seen that with Matt Pottinger's visit and O'Brien's visit to Paris. So we see this need for closer cooperation, which I find very promising along the transatlantic line of discussion. NATO has also put China high on on the discussion, and many, the event held in London was focused largely on China. So we're seeing a redefinition, a re-looking. Europe is not just looking at their immediate neighborhood. They really do understand that the Indo-Pacific is key for their future prosperity as well as security. And I would say, if you read just the High Representative of the EU, Joseph Borrell's blogs, he has, battle of narratives. Everyone is trying to come up with taglines, the new empire. And one of them was my way. So the Europeans like to say, we do it my way. And we have to remember that, Frank Sinatra is also an American singer. So to conclude, what does this mean for India and Europe in the Indo-Pacific? I say the German Indo-Pacific strategy is very promising. We know that the EU is divided, and because you need 27 member states all to speak with one voice, it's impossible to do. So there have been workarounds. We call them variable geometry. And so member states, for example, France, way back in 2016, Le Drian was speaking about this at the Shangri-La Dialogue, trying to get Europe involved. So things have been moving very slowly, but I see slow evolution and things are taking off. So there are many challenges ahead. I remain cautiously optimistic. India is the largest democracy in the world, and the EU share similar values and need to come up with creative ways to tackle these issues and manage the competition and relations with China. Thank you.
So, we've talked about sort of the growing great power competition, the role of middle powers, as Darshana took here, and then sort of the changing views in Europe. Garima, if I could, if you could clean up, a lot of this, as Theresa rightly pointed out, hinges on Germany. France talks about its role in the Indo-Pacific largely based on its own territories in both the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The UK still talks about its military assets and its ability to play a support role in whether it's in the South China Sea or in other areas. Tell us a little bit about Germany's new Indo-Pacific strategy and what prompted it, and also what, given that Germany is not as active a security role player, at least a traditional security player in the Indo-Pacific, how can it actually play a greater role in this evolving landscape?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dhruva. And also thank you to the team at TMR and the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for organizing this panel. Theresa has made my work quite easy. Actually, she's really laid down a good framework of giving an idea where this Indo-Pacific debate was in Europe. As she mentions, even using the term was seen as taboo because it sort of signified taking sides in between the US-China competition. So as several speakers have mentioned, that Germany now has a new Indo-Pacific guideline. And I think it is quite significant because it shows the evolution within European countries outside of France, how the term has gained significance. And there are two reasons for it. Firstly is the problem with China, of course. Economic engagement with China has become increasingly troublesome, problematic, but there are also a number of other factors where the debate in the Indo-Pacific region now mirrors the debate in Europe. This is largely because of China's increasing influence, but on the topics that we heard, for example, Australia, New Zealand, India, others talk about, we have similar debates in Europe, whether it is the strategic impact of BRI projects or 5G technologies, or disinformation, or increasing Chinese influence in international organizations. All of these are issues that today Europe is concerned with. And there's an increasing feeling that you need to work with countries in the Indo-Pacific. They can be useful partners when it comes to dealing with a lot of these China-related challenges. So I would say that even though Europe is not a resident player in the region, a lot of the developments in the region are being mirrored, are at Europe's shores. So there's little, you can't really distance yourself anymore from what is happening in the region. And therefore, we see now after the German strategy, there will be a clear move by Germany, France, Netherlands, a couple of other member states to really push for the EU to adopt this vision as well. They are taking pains to say that this European approach to the Indo-Pacific is different from the US and from other regions. So they're trying to articulate, again, this sort of trying to find a European way forward. But I think when you look at the nitty-gritty, it actually comes to, it's very similar to how India talks about the Indo-Pacific or how Japan talks about the region, inclusive, trying to work with partners partners, but drawing a clear line that if there is a country that does not follow international rules and norms, there are limits to working with them, and you have to find ways around it. So that's the first part of the question you asked. Second, what role can Europe play beyond the security question? And I think there are 4 or 5 important issues where Europe has a role to play. First of all is providing viable alternatives. So in the region, you often hear we don't want to choose a side between US, China. However, what are the alternatives to, for example, BRI investments? And here, when it comes to providing economic alternatives where China is engaged, what pathways do countries have? Europe wants to be an important player and has the ability to actually do so as well. So we've seen Europe, Japan, US, Japan, Australia. They all have their own connectivity strategies, or they're trying to work with different programs for increasing infrastructure building connectivity in the region. The EU signed a partnership with Japan. It wants to work more with India, with Australia, and really investing, bringing in money and providing countries in the region an alternative to BRI investments. So I think that's a really important part that Europe can play. And I have to say, if there are any EU policymakers listening to this, if you are making an Indo-Pacific strategy, it really would not work without connectivity. So really, we need to this is the way to go forward. Second is, I think, issue-based coalitions with strengthening regional institutions. Here, Darshana already mentioned in IORA, Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, several other organizations, even with ASEAN partners, Europe has been working for a while. Now, really, it's time to be smart and align your priorities with priorities of your partners and really see what are the challenges. Most of them are China-related in the Indian Ocean. How can we work with regional partners in overcoming them? The German strategy even mentions BIMSTEC, which is quite interesting. I'd be curious to see how they work on that. But we also saw the France, India, Australia trilateral become official. I think other European countries are also very interested in these trilateral, bilateral, emerging formats. On the question of tackling Chinese influence in international organizations, we saw the EU and Australia work behind the scenes of the World Health Assembly on the question of the origins of the coronavirus. So I think these sort of coalitions, issue-based coalitions, we will see Europe being more keen in taking part in and sort of countering China-related challenges. Third, what I found really interesting in the German guideline was the reference to disinformation by authoritarian actors and countering disinformation. Now, this has been a huge issue given the coronavirus crisis in Europe. But I find it interesting that the Europeans now want to tackle this head on and want to work with Indo-Pacific partners in countering disinformation all over. And fourthly, I think there are economic issues with clear security implications, 5G technologies, other key technologies, critical supply chains. Here are all these debates where Europeans would be keen to plug in the debates in their countries with what countries in the Indo-Pacific are discussing. So really, in a nutshell, Europe's approach to Indo-Pacific has been really to find out, suddenly they've discovered that they need to diversify their partnerships beyond China because it is not working, and that countries in the Indo-Pacific can be really important partners, particularly given friction in transatlantic ties. But I would say even that shouldn't be exaggerated. At the working level on a number of these issues, US officials and Europeans have been working with good results, particularly on issues like connectivity. But overall, I think there is a new discovery of the region. And I do hope that these guidelines can be translated into real policy deliverables. I think that's the real challenge going forward. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
So I mean, that's great. So beyond trade, Europe on economics and trade, on multilateralism, on technology, Europe is a major global player, and therefore will have its position in the Indo-Pacific will have consequences, will have significant play an outsized role. It has the capability, at least, to play an outsized role. We have about 20 minutes left in the session, and I'm going to just start off with 2 questions from the audience. First one directed at Jeff, and the second one to Garima. Jeff first. Somebody asked, should Joe Biden win, how much will he depart from Trump's China policy? But I'll extend that question a little bit to how much do you think he will depart from Trump's Indo-Pacific policies more broadly?
Well, despite my aversion to talking about anything politics related, I'll indulge you here for a minute. Obviously, this is unpredictable. Anybody who tells you they know exactly what's going to happen is pulling a fast one on you. But what I can say is, if you want to look at what a future Biden administration might look like, you need to look to the past, to what Senator Biden and Vice President Biden has done, and also what his team of Asia advisors has done and their views. And I think if you take a sort of objective assessment of that now, it's pretty safe to assume that there is not going to be a dramatic shift back toward engagement with China. Many sort of center-left democratic establishment national security hawks became very disillusioned with China, particularly in the second term of the Obama administration. In fact, President Obama himself became very disillusioned with China, and they began advocating for a much tougher approach, which we did see begin to take shape at the end of the second Obama administration. And in the intervening years, they've had disagreements with President Trump's approach to China, but they've been generally supportive of the notion that we need to get tougher with China, that we need to create a more equitable playing field. And they've been supportive of a lot of the specific measures that have been taken to roll back Chinese influence in the United States, to exclude Chinese high-tech companies from the US, to impose sanctions on Chinese human rights violators, to promote things like the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. You know, on these questions, I think there is general bipartisan consensus. I also think that it is much more difficult to roll back policies that are already in place. And so the policies that the Biden administration will inherit will have an institutional momentum of their own and a built-in support group of their own. And even though the Biden administration may not themselves have implemented these policies, they would find a difficult time rolling them back. There is not a lot of political appetite right now to be taking moves that are seen as friendly toward China or benevolent toward China. And so it's going to inherit a framework and a template that is more confrontational. And I think it has both the interest in maintaining that framework, but will also face resistance to trying to restructure that. And you know, I just go back to the point that this frustration is bipartisan. There are different points of emphasis, but the general consensus is that the engagement policy that guided our approach to China for so long has not worked. And in fact, China has been moving in the opposite direction. So all of that is to say, I do expect more continuity than divergence if President Biden were to win the election.
Thanks, Jeff. Another question for, Garima can take a first crack at it, and perhaps Theresa as well. How important, somebody asked, is India's democracy to its relationship with Europe? So, you know, we have seen sort of greater populism, in many countries, US, Europe, India, in different ways. How much is that still a factor in an emerging India-Europe partnership in this context?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. I think on the rhetoric level, the question of democracy is always important. But we saw that from both sides, Europe and India, both sides had been saying, well, we are democracies, we have common sort of cultural norms, values, we're similar, and then nothing translated onto paper. So the rhetoric base, was basically only on the level of rhetoric. And when it actually came to policies working together, we didn't see eye to eye on a number of issues. And that wasn't necessarily because of domestic political systems, etc. So I think the strength of the relationship is actually that it has transcended the talk of what we have in common to actually thinking about what challenges do we face and can we work in solving them together.
Theresa, actually, would you like to take a step at that? I mean, how does it look from your perspective?
Well, I would agree with Garima that there's a lot of rhetoric, but in terms of economic and these issues, there have been a lot of challenges. And also, But I'm looking at it more optimistically, I guess. The ICAC, the international cooperation between these democracies around the world, we're seeing a huge traction on that here in Brussels. So I think that there is this growing narrative, especially from the parliamentary level, that working with democracies, making the, all right, they're democracies, they make statements, but I think it's shining a big light on what's happening. So I think that there is growing momentum in that area.
Thanks. One question, perhaps Darshana can take a crack at this. Somebody asked, how can India manage its relationship with Russia as it gets closer to Europe and America? And what is the impact of the Russia-China relationship on the India-Russia relationship? When we talk about sort of balancing middle powers, there has been some interest from, obviously India has an older relationship with Russia, but Japan under Shinzo Abe has been trying, often not succeeding, in resetting the terms of engagement with Russia as well. Sometimes to the chagrin of people in the US and in Europe. How do you see, and Darshana could speak to this too, sometimes, for example, it's not just the US, but the French, for example, are really not very happy sometimes about India's continued engagement with Russia. So can you speak a little bit to that? How much is Russia a factor?
Sorry, my bad. I forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, you do see this come up quite a bit, especially in terms of the whole strategic autonomy question. When you see India sign any kind of agreement with the US, the first question you see is like, why is India giving up its strategic autonomy? So is it going to come into an alliance? And or if India goes into a talk with Russia, and that's like, okay, so what does it mean for the Indo-Pacific strategy for India? So if India is working with Russia, that means its whole Indo-Pacific strategy is just vague. But there is a middle ground. I mean, the middle ground is that it's all based on India's interest. That if it is in India's interest, India will work on it. India will work toward it. And I think that goes actually even for Japan. Japan has a really good relationship with Russia. Japan has a really good relationship with Iran that I think is also going to continue. And Japan is one of America's closest allies. I mean, the defense relationship. And I think it applies to India as well, where India will continue to manage its relationship with Russia. Absolutely, India's collaborations with the US, with Australia, with other countries are getting closer. But India still has its... from a defense point of view, we're still pretty closely tied with Russia on that. And I don't see how that is going to just disappear one day. And I don't also think that the success of India's Indo-Pacific strategy or India's approach to Indo-Pacific strategy relies on India embracing one and disregarding the other, or vice versa, that only if it's close to US, it means it has an Indo-Pacific strategy, or that if it's not close to Russia, I think it has to be both. I mean, India will have to manage because it has history, even during those Cold War. I mean, everyone here knows, for a non-aligned country, we did sign the treaties with Soviet Union. So I think that'll be something that'll have to be managed.
Mm-hmm. Garima, how much, if I can turn to you, how much does Russia still feature in, while there may be a convergence between India and Europe on China, how much does Russia still feature in bilateral conversations?
I think the understanding in Europe of India's relationship with Russia has improved a lot. And I think the analogy that most people here would say is that, for example, because India and China share a border and they have proximate neighbors and have different kinds of security concerns. Similarly, Russia and Europe have proximate neighbors and have different concerns. So while Europeans might not see that particular threat from China, India also does not understand that dimension from threat from Russia. And that's completely understandable. So I think the discourse, especially in Europe, in the Europe-India partnership, has moved on beyond it. There's an understanding that India's relationship is qualitatively different with Russia, and the concerns they have would be different too. I think where there's more of a convergence is on the Russia-China factor, actually. And both players are equally interested in seeing how that relationship develops. And you also hear some voices within Europe saying we need to engage more with Russia, just so that the Russia-China relationship, it doesn't become stronger than we want it to be. So I think there's a bit of pragmatic conversation on both sides.
Another question, perhaps I can direct this at Jeff. A lot of the developments you spoke about have been in the works for some time. It predates 2020. There've been signs of it. There's been growing cooperation between India, the US, and others in the region. What has changed with the coronavirus pandemic? What are some of the new mechanisms for engagement that have emerged just in the last 6 months from the US point of view on engaging with the Indo-Pacific?
Well, specifically, we have done a coronavirus pandemic response group that was not really a formal Quad initiative, but does involve all of the Quad countries, as well as South Korea, Vietnam, New Zealand. There have actually been a few different iterations of this regular video conference pandemic response group. Obviously, we in the US have been, and us at Heritage have been very supportive of the Quad more broadly, and we're very eager to see that revived in 2017 and now upgraded to the ministerial level, now doing counterterrorism exercises and potentially even looking to add new elements, new layers of cooperation. So we have been running a Quad Plus dialogue at Heritage for many years now. We see that as a great forum for promoting security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific among these 4 countries. And as you know, India was long seen as the reluctant party in that grouping. And I think the events of the last few years, but certainly of this summer, with the crisis at the China-India border, has really crystallized concerns about China for India and sort of elevated its enthusiasm for these minilateral and multilateral cooperative arrangements in the Indo-Pacific. And frankly, it would be great to see Europe more involved and engaged in some of these initiatives. In our Quad Plus dialogue, we generally bring in an outside partner each year for these Track 1.5 discussions. And France was our partner last year. I think we have UK as a partner this year. We've seen the German Indo-Pacific strategy. There's obviously a lot more interest from Europe in the Indo-Pacific and US engagement there with the Quad. And I think the time is right now to operationalize that engagement. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I've got a so I'll turn it over to you, Theresa.
Theresa, quickly, I mean, we just have a few more minutes left. How much do you think coronavirus has changed European attitudes towards China in particular? I mean, there was some immediate reaction in March and April, a lot of fingers being pointed, but there was also an attempt by the Chinese leadership to engage in mask diplomacy and so forth. How has that panned out?
I think that the COVID-19 situation has actually accelerated negative feelings towards China. You mentioned mass diplomacy. We saw the first country really stricken with COVID-19 was Italy, and this created almost an existential crisis for the EU because Italy reached out and asked for help, and China was there to help them when other EU member states were shutting their borders and not sending any PPE to Italy. So this created a lot of distrust of Brussels, and they were rather missing in action. That was the initial move. China used that to really promote themselves. And if you look at early polls at that time, Italy saw Germany as an enemy and France as an enemy and looked at China very favorably. Now that has changed over the weeks, but I would say that initial response really helped China. But in addition to mass diplomacy, it became wolf was replaced rapidly by wolf warrior diplomacy. So we saw the initial idea of like, we're helping you, we're saving you. And they were conflating aid with actual things that were bought by countries. So we saw many countries in Europe wanting to return this very defective PPE. And so that it became the idea that China was just trying to make money and not really helping them. And so it badly backfired, I think, on Beijing. And so when it was replaced, this kind of negative narrative was replaced by wolf warrior diplomacy. And I think Europeans were so shocked by this kind of language. And I think it also represents that Beijing just didn't care anymore, that they really were kind of rude and nasty, and even it's the first time we've always seen kind of a positive propaganda put out by the PRC, but this was the first time we saw disinformation, and that really came with COVID-19. So we saw pressure on the EU to remove a sentence that referred to COVID-19 in a rather anodyne EU-China happy 45 years of relations. So they were forced to remove that sentence. And then they were also, Beijing alerted Brussels that they were unhappy with the disinformation report because they called out China using disinformation campaign around the world to change the narrative about COVID-19. So the EU was willing to massage that, but then later they actually released the report largely intact. So I think that there's really a growing anger. And before, I think many European citizens felt that China was far away, but now every single person has been under lockdown, or they haven't been able to attend their mother's funeral, or they can't get married, or they lost their job. So I think everybody has been affected, and they understand, that what happens in China affects them directly. So I think it has dramatically changed the narrative.
Thank you. Thanks to all four of you for what was a really engaging and an informative discussion. I think we are out of time now. So I'll turn it back to Shubh to wrap up. So thank you again on behalf of the audience, on behalf of myself, and for a really engaging conversation.